from Washington, D.C.
Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We'll continue to follow the breaking news on Apple's new CEO later in the program. But we begin tonight with a dimming hope for an Iran ceasefire extension after President Trump told Bloomberg it's, quote, highly unlikely he would agree to extend the truce, increasing the urgency for negotiators to come to a long-term deal to end the war. Vice President JD Vance heading to Islamabad for another round of talks with just 2 days until the ceasefire expires. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan is joining us live from the White House North Lawn with more. And Kate, what's the latest we know?
That's right. So it is a very delicate and high stakes moment right now. This ceasefire, as you mentioned, is set to expire Wednesday evening. And there was some confusion about when exactly the ceasefire would expire. But the president told my colleague Jeff Mason in an exclusive interview earlier today that this would be expiring on Wednesday evening if there was not a deal to extend it. And he said it was highly unlikely if a deal was not reached that he would be extending it, which is a very notable point. The vice president is set to travel to Pakistan for the next round of in-person talks. You'll remember he led the last round of talks in Islamabad where there was no deal reached. Pakistan has been a very critical mediator here. And this is coming at a moment where there are really inflamed tensions. Over the weekend, an Iranian vessel was seized by U.S. forces. And Trump said that the ship had violated the naval blockade, something that the president said, the naval blockade would be staying in place until a deal was finalized. Iran says that the blockade is a violation of a ceasefire. So as you can tell, it's a very uncertain, high stakes, delicate moment here.
Yeah. Kate, we've got breaking news that is just crossing the terminal right now. It appears the Labor Secretary is out of a job. This may not come as a surprise to our listeners and viewers who have been following the investigation into Secretary Lori Chavez-DeRemer, but she is going to take a post in the private sector, according to the White House. Kate, this is something, as I mentioned, is developing before our eyes here. Stephen Chung, the White House spokesman, saying she'll be leaving the administration to take a position in the private sector, having done a phenomenal job in her role by protecting American workers, enacting fair labor practices, and helping Americans gain additional skills to improve their lives. Keith Sonderling will take the role of acting Secretary of Labor. But, of course, she was facing some pretty severe allegations, Kate, including having an affair with a security detail member, alcohol misuse, travel fraud, bringing staff to a strip joint, not to mention harassment claims that have been posed against her husband. What can you tell us about this?
There's clearly a lot there. This is, I think it's interesting. This is coming not long after Pam Bondi was ousted, after Kristi Noem left her role. I think that at the beginning of the Trump his second term, there was a real effort to try to minimize the turnover. This seemed to be something that Susie Wiles and other top officials really wanted to contain. This wanted people to stay in their roles. Now, after a year in, it seems like things are shifting. And this, of course, was a very different case from what happened with Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem. But I think it is notable. We're seeing a lot of shifting now. And I'm just curious, in the coming days and weeks, and whether there's going to be further shakeups.
Yeah. Kate, thank you. That's now a red headline on the terminal. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live from the White House. We now add the voice of Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania, who's been patiently standing by on Capitol Hill with the news breaking as a member of the House Appropriations and Foreign Affairs Committees. And Congresswoman, it's great to have you. Thank you for standing by. I thought we'd be starting off here with a conversation about Iran, but to see another cabinet member be shown the door, this is quite remarkable in the wake of Kristi Noem and, of course, the former Attorney General Pam Bondi. What does this tell us about the stability of this administration?
That's exactly the word, that it is not stable. And it's very worrisome. We are at war. So we see that she's been fired. She'll be out today. And the cliche, she's going to the private sector. After scandal after scandal, I won't comment on those. I don't know the facts of them. But the president surrounded himself with an awful lot of people in most important roles, labor, when we're talking about growing this economy. And he put in people who are not up to the job, not to mention those who are scandal-ridden. Now we have 3 women, notably, out. I would imagine that Mr. Hegseth and Kash Patel should be very worried. Mr. Hegseth is showing that he's not able to control the media on this war or put forward the strategy that gives anybody confidence, as exhibited by our president. And Mr. Patel, of course, is facing his own challenges with all of the reporting around excessive drinking, unable to find him, unable to waken him, and actually needing to get breaching material to get into his room to find him. These are people in the most serious of positions at a most serious of times in this country. So I hope the president stops the long tweets that shows he's in a little bit of a free fall here and starts surrounding himself with qualified people.
Well, Congresswoman, just quickly to follow up on what you said about the times being serious, given that we are still, even if there is a ceasefire for now, engaged with Iran in a military and diplomatic way, and there's potential threats emanating from Iran and the terrorism that it has long sponsored and inspired, is now really the time to be thinking about a shakeup at the FBI or at the Defense Department, or does it make it all the more urgent?
I think it makes it all the more urgent because they've showed themselves to be unqualified. So it could instill confidence in this country if you put somebody in charge of defense to say we have a strategy here for diplomatic work to wind this thing down, to get our service members home so that no more will be injured. We have 13 dead. We have hundreds wounded. Thousands of civilians have been killed and injured. To me, put somebody in who's capable of the job. Mr. Hegseth was over his head from the start. Kash Patel, you know, he's been in front of our committee. He showed himself to be, and completely unqualified. And you were talking about the FISA reauthorization. Here we have the head of the FBI who needs to keep us safe from the threat of global terror, domestic terror as well. And he's having a hard time even showing up for work.
You're an appropriator, Congresswoman. What is this going to mean now with 3 departures on cabinet level positions when it comes to the budgeting process? Wouldn't all of these individuals have had to come to Capitol Hill to testify about their respective agencies?
I think the Labor Secretary was scheduled for this week, and I do wonder if there is a connection between her firing today and not coming before the committee. The challenge is that, of course, in a normal appropriations process, each of the secretaries would come before us with detailed understanding of their budget request, of the president's budget request. We have seen that didn't happen well last year. Many didn't even come. And we've seen how poorly those who do come testify, don't seem to actually know the budgets, can't fully defend it. Kash Patel last year asked for $1 billion more than the actual budget request by the president, didn't know what he was asking for. So this is not a budget ordinary year, but we'll do our part as appropriators, especially Democrats on the committee. We'll do our part to make sure we look through these budgets with a fine-tooth comb and reveal the values that this president is putting forward. Huge dollars for defense, more money for ICE and CBP that they're trying to sneak in when they have billions and billions of dollars, whereas they want to cut health care, mental health, addiction, housing, hunger, and food services. Please watch these appropriations hearings. How this money is spent reveals the priorities of the majority party as they carry the water for the President of the United States.
Well, we know, Congresswoman, that a good deal of money has already been spent in the Middle East, and given that we are maintaining a U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, I would imagine that takes even more resources. On the blockade, we've heard repeatedly from President Trump, both in conversations he's had with our colleagues like Bloomberg's Jeff Mason today, as well as on social media, that that blockade will not end until there is a deal with Iran. And I wonder how you're viewing the blockade as a tool. Is it effective in getting the United States more leverage, or is it making it more difficult for this to reach some kind of conclusion?
Well, Kayleigh and Joe, if you have the Strait reporting on this, you could help me. I'm not sure if we're blockading or Iran is blockading, because I've heard both out of this administration as well as out of Iran. It shows, obviously, that the president took no heed to what the experts must have told him. If you go to war with Iran, you will disrupt economic flow, oil flow, fertilizer flow, all kinds of goods through the Strait of Hormuz. Apparently he didn't either take heed of that or take it very seriously. And now we're stuck. We're either blockading or they're blockading. His UN ambassador, Mike Waltz, over the weekend said that it is improper to blockade. So if it's improper, are we in the business of something improper with a blockade? I can't tell you actually what's going on there. I do hope, let me say something hopeful. I do hope that renewed diplomatic talks actually have a chance. That's where we should have been all along. War should be a last resort. Everybody knows that. But now we are spending billions and billions and billions of dollars at a time when our economy is in such a tough strait. Instead of on here at home, reducing prices, making sure we are growing jobs, instead we're blowing billions of dollars on a war that no one wanted.
Well, so we've got a new deadline, Congresswoman, and we should note for our listeners and viewers that in the president's conversation with Bloomberg today, he told Jeff Mason it was Wednesday night, not Tuesday night, as we had all been factoring in for the end of this 2-week ceasefire. So it appears that he has added 1 day. From your perch on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congresswoman, if there's no deal by the end of the day Wednesday, what's going to happen?
Might I use the expression taco? The president changes his mind. Oh. He will tell you one thing today, and he will tell you something else. I think, Joe, it was only 2 weeks ago that we were sitting on words from the president that said he was going to end a civilization by 8 p.m. Wednesday. Think of the insanity of that kind of expression. So I don't think Wednesday's a real deadline. I hope and pray the ceasefire holds. I hope and pray the negotiated ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is real and it holds. And I believe the president will turn, I hope, and realize this war is a failure. It's hurting him. It's hurting his legacy. His numbers could not be worse. He doesn't even have his former MAGA base. They're all railing about the unwise nature of this war and what it's doing to our economy, not to mention what it's doing to the challenge of our military. So I don't think Wednesday's a real deadline, but with this president, you can't take anything for granted. When he claimed he was willing to end a civilization, war crimes, genocide, you got to take him seriously, even as he is unhinged and unwell.
And Congresswoman, finally, if we could return to the breaking news we were dealing with when you first joined us, that the current Labor Secretary Lori Chavez-DeRemer is out. Keith Sonderling, who's currently the Deputy Secretary, is now going to take on the role of Acting Secretary of Labor. And I wonder, given the precedent that was set by President Joe Biden in maintaining Julie Su as acting Secretary of Labor for years because she could not get the requisite confirmation votes in the Senate, if you're worried now that essentially we could just have an acting Secretary of Labor for the foreseeable future if President Trump so chooses, because that was the choice of his predecessor.
Well, it wasn't actually the choice of his predecessor. In that one case, yes. But remember, Trump won. He was surrounded by more acting this and acting that than anybody could stand. And so I do think anybody in these secretary positions should have to come before the Senate for confirmation. Unfortunately, this Senate has been a rubber stamp for the very people we just talked about, 3 of whom are now out, 2 others of whom I hope are on the chopping block. This Senate did not do its job in actually taking a look at the resumes, the credentials, the abilities, the skills of the folks that they were confirming. So acting or confirmed in this administration, there's not a great difference. But of course, by regular order, by the seriousness of these jobs like Labor Secretary at a time when our economy is struggling so hard, of course it should be a confirmed position.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you for joining with us, especially as we learned of breaking news right as we came to air. Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, we want to turn back to some other breaking news that we were dealing with this evening coming out of Apple, with John Ternus being named as the new CEO starting September 1st, and Tim Cook will become executive chairman. For the latest, we want to bring in Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Tech, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. So, Ed, perhaps the pick itself, not surprising, but what do we need to know about him? And specifically for our audience here on Balance of Power, what is this going to change when we think about the relationships that this company had built in this White House?
Yeah, Bloomberg readers and our regular Bloomberg audience will not be surprised that John Ternus was kind of the heir apparent to Tim Cook. Maybe the timing is surprising. Apple reports earnings next Thursday. John Ternus is an engineer. He's been at Apple since 2001. He's had an increasing portfolio of hardware-focused responsibility, hardware engineering, but more recently, that focused on product testing in other teams. He was really building a much broader remit. And right at the beginning of the year, when Apple saw a flood of different departures, Tim Cook basically explained to all of their employees at an all hands that when people get to age 65, Tim Cook is himself 65, sometimes they want to do something new, something fresh, and that he was kind of personally fixated on who would be leading Apple 5 or 10 years from now. So there was no indication at that time that he was on the verge of retiring. He's becoming executive chairman, and the language in Apple's statement is so deliberate that he will be focused on communicating with policymakers around the world. Really speaks to his expertise in operations, supply chain, Apple's global footprint in very different jurisdictions. So the read, like there's hardly any after-hours market reaction. It's muted, is that everything kind of carries on. You know, this product focus, hardware focus from John Ternus, and that Tim Cook, you know, really, he's not going anywhere just yet.
Really interesting, Ed. So the engineer stays on the drawing board and then the C-suite. Does that mean we see more of Tim Cook in the Oval Office?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, right? You and I have talked so often about the changing relationship of Tim Cook with the White House. You know, we've moved on from Tim Apple, right? And Apple really being conscious of positioning itself in the direction of travel, which is reindustrialization of American industry and technology. Apple's concessions on that front have not been as bold as, say, Meta. You know, Mark Zuckerberg very proudly saying, oh, I'll spend $600 billion in America over the next 3 years. For Apple, it was much more muted. Started with products, doing a bit more in Texas with Mac, doing more server work in the United States. But he's been able to maintain some proximity to the president in this administration. Not to the extent that a Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, has, not at the same personable level that Jensen Huang has done with this president, but he's done it nonetheless. This is a playbook that we observe in Silicon Valley, right? One example is Ruth Porat. When she stood down as the long-term CFO of Alphabet, parent of Google, and became president, she kind of took this global governance and policymaker relationship role with her. And so it's been done, but it sort of speaks to Tim Cook's expertise.
Well, and of course, when we think about the topics that he had to liaise with the White House on, we know that he very much tried to insulate Apple from the effects of the president's tariffs, which aren't necessarily an abandoned effort, even if he had to change the mechanism with which he pursues such things. Ed, for a new CEO coming in, how much is he going to be grappling with the idea that Apple needs to be still moving supply chains into different countries where they may not be so easily affected by geopolitical matters? I just wonder how much legwork Tim Cook already did in that regard and what a new CEO is going to have to do.
Yeah, this is not easy to answer succinctly, but basically a mainstay of Apple's production of the handsets, the iPhones, is done in China. And to de-risk that, they've increasingly done a greater proportion of handsets out of India. I think I remember speaking with you guys on Balance of Power about the great airlift of handsets out of India into the United States. But at that time, it was such a small proportion of global output. You know, John Ternus, again, I go back to his growing portfolio. It's documented and reported on in detail by Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. It went beyond just hardware engineering to product testing to other hardware teams. He will have a firm grasp on this. But again, clearly the wording of the statement from Apple is that this is not Tim Cook leaving. In executive chair, he actually has a sort of a greater focus on strategy. And you know, Bloomberg Intelligence's Mandeep Singh, for what it's worth, someone that I greatly admire in his research, you know, he thinks that this will be Tim Cook even more zeroed in on supply chain than perhaps he was as CEO.
Great context. Ed Ludlow on the breaking story. Thank you so much, Ed. The host, of course, co-host of Bloomberg Tech, with us live here on Balance of Power as we turn back to the other story breaking just this hour. The departure of the Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer. Labor Secretary, now the third cabinet member dismissed by the president in just the last couple of months. We, of course, consider Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and the now former Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's get into it all with Bloomberg's Amara Omokwe and Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who runs our Capital Influence team. Megan, there was an ethics committee investigation underway here, an internal watchdog, I should say, Inspector General investigation. Does this tell us all we need to know about what was inside that probe?
There have long been issues Secretary DeRemer, former Secretary DeRemer's husband, was actually barred from the Labor Department just several months ago due to sexual assault allegations among other female staffers there. Then, of course, we have the news that broke last week from the New York Times on text messages between the secretary and young staff, and also between her father and I believe her husband and staff as well. So it's certainly, it's been interesting to watch the dominoes fall. During Trump's first term, he kept, changing over staff repeatedly from pretty much the outset of the administration. He really kept his core group together, though, for the first 14 months or so of this administration. But now we're starting to see, as you just showed on the screen, three secretary-level positions being let go just in the past 6 weeks or so.
All of them women, as was just pointed out to us by Congresswoman Madeleine Dean. And we also asked her about the notion that of having an acting labor secretary for potentially an extended period of time, as we just experienced in the Biden administration with Julie Su, who wasn't able to get the requisite votes in the Senate. Megan, not obviously, he is dealing with a Republican control in the Senate right now that has basically passed through every nominee that he's put forward. But could that have been a precedent kind of setting of Biden's, that Trump could just continue on specifically with this department?
Possibly. He certainly could. But as you said, he does, for now, hold the Senate majority. That could change, of course, after the November midterm elections. So I suspect he will want to try to get that through before the end of this year. There are 53 Republican seats, and he has, by and large, managed to keep his party together on these key votes, with the big exception being Kevin Warsh, of course.
Yeah, what's interesting is not the only confirmation hearing we're going to be tracking. We've got one tomorrow in Kevin Warsh. Amara, this is a story that you're going to be covering, and there's a big question about when we might see a vote. These are two very different things, having a hearing and actually confirming.
Yeah, and that's anybody's guess, because we know that Republican Senator Tom Tillis has vowed to hold up Warsh's nomination as long as this DOJ investigation of Chair Jerome Powell and the Fed continues. And what you're going to hear at this hearing tomorrow, you're going to see Warsh questioned about the big idea of Fed independence, because we have this backdrop where Trump has put a lot of pressure on the Fed for lower rates, the DOJ investigation, his attempt to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook. And you already have Democrats like Senator Elizabeth Warren saying that they fear that Warsh is going to be a sock puppet for President Trump. And so you're definitely going to hear lawmakers, particularly on the Democratic side, questioning whether Warsh will be sufficiently independent. You're also going to hear them ask about his outlook for interest rates. In the months leading up to his nomination, he made the case that interest rates should be lower. He talked about productivity. He talked about shrinking the Fed's balance sheet as a way to get lower interest rates. But of course, the economic backdrop has changed a lot with the war in Iran. That could push up inflation. And so you're going to hear lawmakers asking, does he still think rates should be coming down right now?
Well, and for financial markets, Amara, who right now are betting that the Fed is essentially going to choose stasis for the foreseeable future, not hiking, not cutting, is there anything that Kevin Warsh could say tomorrow that would lead to a repricing, do you think?
I don't think so, because what Fed officials are saying is that we already had stubborn inflation even before the Iran war, right? The Fed officials were already signaling that they felt like rates were in a good position and that they would need to see a lot more progress on inflation before they would feel comfortable resuming interest rate cuts. So I think what markets will really be looking for is how Warsh threads the needle on this question of independence and interest rates and what he's going to do. The president made clear that he wants someone in the Fed chair seat who's going to lower interest rates. So how can Warsh reassure the markets that he's going to be sufficiently independent when he has that pressure already from Trump in the background?
All right, Bloomberg's Mara Mokwei and Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you both so much. And make sure to tune into Balance of Power tomorrow night at 5 p.m. Eastern when we speak with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, after Kevin Warsh's hearing. Now let's turn to the latest developments in the Iran war. With less than 2 days to go until the end of the currently agreed to Iran ceasefire, the president now says he'll likely not extend the 2-week truce, even as Vice President JD Vance is set to resume U.S.-Iran negotiations in Pakistan as early as tomorrow. Joining us live with the latest from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York is Bloomberg's Lyndsay Howard, senior analyst for foreign policy. Lyndsay, thank you for joining us. Clearly, we're getting one kind of message from President Trump, and we've gotten very different messaging consistently from Iran. As it stands now, are these talks going to happen? And what's the likelihood that they can be successful given the escalation in hostilities we saw over the weekend?
Kayleigh, thank you. That is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? Vice President Vance is en route to Islamabad for renewed ceasefire talks. President Trump has said we don't know if the Iranian delegation will even be there. So there's a lot of noise, but a lot of unclear signals about what will happen with this ceasefire and what the prospects are. Meanwhile,
it's great to have you with us. We were really taken by the fact, and pardon my interruption, that the president added a day to the timeline here. This was originally going to be end of the day on Tuesday. Now it's end of the day on Wednesday. I just asked the Congresswoman, Madeleine Dean, what happens if there is no deal by then? She said taco. How about you?
Well, I believe in FAFO tacos, if we can use both those phrases, meaning that Trump has been actually very effective in deploying tactics and strategies which are difficult to watch from the outside, but sometimes achieve their objectives. It was very uncomfortable, of course, to watch him say that he would destroy Persian civilization, not to mention what many consider, or many of our allies consider, a potential war crime. But going back to the front, what might happen here? Well, between a 10-point Iranian plan and a 15-point U.S. plan, both mapped out in maximalist positions, which is part of negotiation, and we can expect more of that. We still wonder if there are prospects for some kind of ceasefire, because if a ceasefire, some modicum of a ceasefire is achieved, that could move the Strait of Hormuz from being a hot war to a cold war. And that said, even with what some call a grand bargain offer to Iran by the U.S. and a luxury Tiffany offer on terms such as lifting of sanctions, unfreezing of $20 billion in assets, and of course, the potential for this regime to survive its greatest existential threat since 1979. There's a lot at play here, and we can't see what's going to happen.
Well, we appreciate you trying to see through the noise as much as possible with us. Bloomberg's Lyndsay Howard, thank you so much. And joining us now for more analysis is Jane Harman, former Democratic Congresswoman from California and former ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee. She's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Jane, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We know that the vice president is making tracks to Islamabad, Pakistan. Does that signal to you that the U.S. is pretty confident that Iran will be showing up for these conversations? Would you send the second highest ranking official in the United States government if you weren't pretty certain?
I think they're pretty certain some level of Iranian negotiator will show up. Again, there doesn't seem to be coherence and consistency on the Iranian side either. So somebody will be there. And sending JD Vance is kind of a mixed message because he failed the last time, and at least the scuttlebutt is out there that maybe Trump doesn't mind if he fails again. However, I hope he succeeds. I agree with my good friend Lyndsay Howard that it would be good to have a good outcome, but I'm not very optimistic. I think, as I've said many times, Trump just watches the markets. And to get the Strait of Hormuz open is his highest priority, not regime change, not somehow removing some of the highly enriched uranium, not the Iranian people, not the American people, surely not the U.S. Congress, which is still not doing much. But if he can make a stop-for-stop deal with the Iranians and open the Strait, I think that will help the markets, and he would love that. So let's go there. Then maybe that can lead to more. One other thing that is going well, this is not exactly, at least in my view, a good news story, but one thing that's going well, I think, is the Lebanon-Israeli peace. And if there can be some settlement there, and Hezbollah could be pushed out of the Lebanese government, that's a win-win. A win for Lebanon, a win for Israel. It's actually a win for Trump, too. So put that on the table.
You know, Jane, sometimes in this cycle, we really need to stop and take stock of where we are and maybe what happened just in the past couple of days. In this case, A lot of Americans woke up this morning in a different world they thought they were in on Friday. And if you go back and look at the president's Truth Social feed from Friday, and this went throughout the day, Iran has just announced the Strait of Iran, as he called it then, is open and ready for business. The Strait of Hormuz completely open. The USA will get all nuclear dust. A great and brilliant day for the world. Iran has agreed to never close the Strait again. I could keep going. Was he projecting? Was he misinformed?
He's doing all of those things. You know, Richard Nixon invented the madman theory of negotiation, and it's okay if it ends up in a good place. I would love this to end up in a good place, but at the moment, it's very chaotic. And a disappointment to me is that we continue with an inexperienced negotiating team. They may be fine fellows, but they don't bring any experience like the experience the Obama negotiators brought. One thing Trump could do now is add some experienced negotiators, Republican experienced negotiators. And what about reaching for some of our allies? Instead of pushing them away, what about embracing them? Or international organizations like the IAEA, which actually has a lot of experience on removing or at least policing nuclear material. And what about our intelligence folks? There's none of them in this delegation, and all kinds of rumors about what Iran is doing and moving nuclear materials around. I don't know if any of that's true, and I don't need to read it in my newspaper. I would prefer classified intelligence briefings to those who need to know it.
Well, so as we consider the people on the U.S. side of this table, at the talks in Islamabad, the first go-around, the Speaker of Iran's parliament was representing Iran, Mohammad Ghalibaf, who actually just posted on social media that Trump wants to turn this negotiating table into a surrender table or justify reigniting the war as he sees fit. We do not accept negotiations under the shadow of threats. And I wonder if you see this as posturing, knowing Iran before the first round also said we won't show up to negotiations unless you unfreeze all our assets, or if you really see Iran's position as becoming more intractable, not less so.
I think Iran is more intractable. I think they, as Trump would say, have a lot of cards. They just need speedboats to block the Strait of Hormuz. There's not going to be regime change in Iran anytime soon, and all the canisters of highly enriched uranium, wherever they are not going to be pulled out of holes, certainly not by U.S. boots on the ground. And I don't think Trump wants to take the risk of high U.S. casualties, especially since Congress is not there. Can I just put my Kako thing again out there? Congress always chickens out. It's not just taco, it's Kako.
So when we get to the 60-day mark, you don't think that Congress will be there with
Well, so far as I know.
But they've all failed so far.
Well, they have failed to act, correct. And if Trump would put boots on the ground without congressional action, shame on him, but also shame on Congress. That is an irresponsible act. It's not consistent with our Constitution. And our government, you'd think, especially in an election year, those up for re-election, that would not be President Trump, need to show that they're being responsible.
Well, speaking of congressional failures to act, and this does tie back to the war with Iran, given terrorism sponsorship and inspiration that Iran generates, we have not seen a long-term extension of Section 702 of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You yourself, of course, were ranking member on the Intel Committee. You were a member of the Gang of Eight. What is the consequence if this is not extended in time for our own national security?
Well, there is some argument that our surveillance court, we have one, has sort of kind of issued a one-year extension, so the authorities might still be in place until 2027. But that's not a good answer. The right answer is to extend the law. And there's something President Trump is doing right. Let me say it. He's doing it right. He's for an extension of FISA, not for 10 minutes, but for a period of years. And FISA is crucial to us. It is how we learn what foreign actors are intending to attack us in the United States. It is already the case, both under our Constitution and under law, under changes in the FISA law, that any American contact has to be minimized. The constitutional protections apply to Americans. I don't know whether this FBI would adhere fully to that, but they're supposed to. That is U.S. law. And so having members of Congress say, oh, dear, privacy, privacy, I'm sensitive to privacy, but I'm also counting on constitutional and legal guarantees to make FISA work. And I think the consequences of letting FISA expire are catastrophic at a time when all of our attention is paid on this war of choice in Iran, and all kinds of other things could go wrong. I mean, think China.
With your old Intel committee hat on still, what do you make of the story about Kash Patel, his $250 million lawsuit against The Atlantic? It's alleged that he has a drinking problem. Does he need to go?
Well, that's not my decision to make, and I don't know that those allegations are true, and I don't want to convict him on this show. I think they have to be taken seriously, and I just said that the FBI and its director are crucial to preventing attacks inside the U.S. and from foreign actors connected into the U.S. I mean, the FBI takes over once the FISA authorities connect into the U.S. because the FBI is protecting U.S. persons. That's what we're talking about. So I hope he's up to it, and these allegations are very alarming.
Jane, thank you. It's great to have you with us in studio.
And I'm here.
Indeed.
It's good
Jane
to see
Harman,
you.
duly noted, former Democratic Congresswoman from California. We thank you as ever. Joining us now with their reaction to all of these breaking stories, we've had our share today. Our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. We've been talking a lot about Iran here, guys, but I have to get back to the breaking story, and that is another cabinet secretary shown the door in the Labor Secretary. Secretary DeRemer is now joining the private sector, according to the administration. Jeannie, what does this tell us as we look right now, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, the faces of three women, Noam, Bondi, DeRemer? How come only women have been shown the door?
Yeah, you know, there's been some talk of this, and now that she is joining the trio, it's going to be heightened talk of this. In this case, of course, she is subject to an investigation. There has been an internal investigation. I think it is the best move for the administration. It's not unusual. But of course, to your question, these are three women. And you just asked Jane about the issue of Kash Patel. I think there's a lot of questions there as well. And that would put one of the guys into the mix. So we may see that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I guess we'll see, to Jeannie's point, Rick, if more heads will roll here. But do you think President Trump is going to be willing to have more high-profile departures when he's already had three in a row, given for, 14 months now, he has kept his original team together to this point?
Yeah, I think in each of these cases we've just discussed, it's more their conduct that's forced Trump's hand than Trump wanting to make changes. I think he would have probably preferred to keep everybody in place, at least through the midterms. But when you've misbehaved in the way that these individuals have, then something's got to be done. In this case with Lori DeRemer, you had an internal investigation that was pretty damning to both her and her husband, and something had to happen. And she took herself out of play. And in this case, probably with the vast approval of the White House team, who said, yeah, we've got to make you go away because you're a liability to the administration. And so is this the only one? Is this the last shoe to drop? Who knows? There are all kinds of different issues. We've been talking about the FBI director. The Commerce Secretary has some issues with the Epstein files. You want to go through the list. It could take all night. We don't have enough time in this program.
We're working on it, Rick. Pete Hegseth might be another one to mention there, Jeannie, and of course he's playing a very critical role right now in this administration. The whole rap on Donald Trump was, though, I think as Kayleigh refers, that he was not the type to admit defeat, or in this case, a bad hire. What does it tell us when he gets to the point of removing a cabinet official?
Yeah, I mean, this was what we were told going into the second term, that he was not going to be exercising his usual "you're fired" comment to his own people.
Yeah.
Because
no apologies.
No apologies. But they, you know, I do think it's a lot to ask in any administration that you keep a cabinet intact. These are high-level, high-pressure jobs. And all three of the women we just spoke about, and then if you add Lutnick, as Rick mentioned, if you add Patel, if you add Hegseth, as you mentioned, these are people who have brought to the administration challenges that just may become insurmountable for the president and so distracting that he needs to get rid of them. But I would say one in particular, Pete Hegseth, has so ill-served this president that it would be in the national interest for him to move him aside. But I'm not sure we're going to see that happen anytime soon. This was a blunder of epic proportions getting into this war. And if Hegseth was pushing that, he should be somebody who sees the door.
Well, certainly this war has had an economic impact and translated to higher gasoline prices at home. And, Rick, I don't know if the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, is in any danger of being ousted himself, but President Trump made it known today in an interview that he disagrees with Wright's assessment that gasoline won't be back below $3 a barrel, or at least or a gallon, or there's a risk of that until next year. And I just wonder how you view President Trump's insistence that, no, that is not the case, as we consider where he wants to push the trajectory of this conflict or its resolution with Iran, knowing that it is going to translate into the costs that Americans are facing.
Yeah, look, one of the great advantages of President Trump is he actually believes that by his words and his deeds alone, he can actually make material things change. So if he says that gas prices are going down, he believes he can actually make gas prices go down. If he says that he believes that he can get Iran to surrender, then he actually thinks that's an outcome that without any negotiation, he could probably get done. So these are examples of the way that Donald Trump has operated for a long, long time. He actually has this view of the power that his words and his threats and his condolences or however he wants to approach the issue are actually material to getting an outcome. And I think that is the approach he's currently taking, that whether it's gas prices, the economy, inflation, housing, he just says that this is going to change, and he believes it'll change. Now, obviously, he's playing to the markets. He's playing to the voters. He wants them to believe that there's a better future. But there's a timeline on all of this stuff politically. And there's no set moment that the voters say, oh, it's not true, or it's not going to happen, or gas prices aren't coming down. But they do check in on that, and they're going to make a decision. And the fear the White House has today is voters are already making that determination now and are going to decide how they're going to vote currently for the midterm elections. And that really is a problem for this White House.
Well, that tendency includes moving the goalposts, in this case, on an ultimatum against Iran. Jeannie, we had news today at Bloomberg when our own Jeff Mason got on the phone with Donald Trump that the new deadline is Wednesday night, not tomorrow night, as the world had thought. What do you make of that decision?
You know, I think it's another example of Donald Trump trying to get Iran to meet them in Islamabad. And it just shows, I think, that he knows what he said is not true, which is that time is not on his side. And Rick was just talking about this. All Iran has to do is survive. They feel like that is their goal, survive. And survive for 40 days they have. The president has a much shorter time frame. That's why we are the ones pushing for a negotiated settlement to this thing, and Iran is hemming and hawing. And so when the president says, I'm going to extend that deadline, I think it is his nod to that reality. And I think what has to happen once they get to that table is we have to work very hard on restoring trust between these two sides. And the White House should be darn sure that the president stays off social media afterwards. Because after the first meeting, he went on social media and said things that dismantled whatever headway they had made. He can't do that again. It puts the United States in a much tougher position if we want to get this thing behind us.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our political panel this evening, thank you so much. Dealing with us some breaking news as we came to air, not just, of course, that the idea that Lori Chavez-DeRemer is out as the Secretary of Labor, but also that John Ternus is in as the CEO of Apple, or at the very least, he will be as of September 1st. Tim Cook, of course, Joe, is moving to the role of executive chairman, going to be overseeing relationships like the one with the White House.
He's going to have to join us on Balance of Power if he's talking
We'd
policy
love
all
that.
the time now. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.